How are you this evening?
Very good. Doing my best.
Wonderful. And I see Jai Krishna is also there, huh?
He is. Hare Krishna Lakshmi.
Haribo.
Haribo.
Good to,
Haribo.
good to hear your voice.
Good to see you, Prabhu.
Mhm.
To see you.
Are-
Let's talk next week when you come back from Puerto Rico before I head to the Far East.
Sounds good. Sounds like a plan. Wonderful. All right, so let's get going on the Bhagavad Gita. It is currently 7:01, so let's begin. And we're reading from Bhagavad Gita as it is by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, chapter 8, verse 17. Very interesting series of verses that we'll be discussing. Before we do so, let us begin with the invocation mantras to create the mood of auspiciousness. Om Gana Timarannasya Kinanjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Padamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Astitya Deshvatarine Jaya Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasri Gaur Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, let us start with text 17, chapter 8 of the Bhagavad Gita. In order to create some nice auspiciousness, I'd like to chant the Sanskrit verse here. That will set the mood, set the tone for the class. And it reads as follows: Sahasra Yuga Paryantam Arhar Yad Brahmano Viduhu Ratrim Yuga Sahasrantam Teho Ratra Vido Janaha. By human calculation, 1,000 ages taken together form the duration of Brahma's one day. and such also is the duration of his night. So I thought the best way to explain this verse is to read the purport as written by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, because it really, the way Prabhupada explains it's very comprehensively done. So this will be a very nice way to get a sense of this verse. Krishna is telling Arjuna, by human calculation, 1,000 ages taken together form the duration of Brahma's one day, and such also is the duration of his night. And this is explained as follows. The duration of the material universe is limited. It is manifested in cycles of kalpas. A kalpa is a day of Brahma, and one day of Brahma consists of 1,000 cycles of 4 yugas, or ages, which are Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwarpara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. Now, I want to just put the pause button here on the purport, just to explain that Krishna is so wise that he comes at this very basic point, the distinction between Prakriti, or the material energy, and Purusha, the spiritual energy, in different ways. In the 7th chapter, he explains Prakriti, or the material energy, by saying earth, water, fire, air, ether. These are the 5 gross elements. Mind, intelligence, and ego. These are the 3 subtle elements. 8 material elements total comprise Prakriti, which means Prakriti is not life, is not infused with life. It is matter, as opposed to Purusha, which is spirit. And spirit is eternal life, eternally activated or motivated and full of consciousness. That's the way Krishna explains it there in 2nd chapter. Krishna gives different sides of the coin, again, to make clear that point. And why? Because one cannot really understand one's true nature unless the understanding or the distinction between matter and spirit is there. So that's why Krishna approaches this subject matter in a number of different ways. What is Prakriti comprised of? He tells us: earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and ego. What is Purusha comprised of? It is the jiva, or the soul, which is everywhere. The jiva is everywhere. There are billions and billions of jivas, or souls, everywhere throughout all creation, through all manifestation. And then, of course, there's the Param Purush, which is the supreme soul, the super soul. So in this way, Krishna, for our benefit and for our edification and for our progress on our spiritual path, is raising this point again and again by giving us different perspectives. So this perspective that Krishna is talking about right now is, he's saying that even though the material universe may exist for many, many millions of years, and there are living entities that inhabit this universe for many, many millions of years. I think Brahma, a guesstimate or a calculation of Brahma's lifespan is 1 trillion plus years. So Krishna is saying that it doesn't matter that for someone like Brahma, who may live 1 trillion years, or someone like us, who may have a lifespan of 75 to 100, all are subject to repeated birth and death. So he's making that point very, very clear. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth as I read this commentary further. The cycle of Satya Yuga is characterized by virtue, wisdom, and religion, there being practically no ignorance and vice. And the Yuga lasts 1,728,000 years. And, I just read something interesting about a cave that was recently unearthed by archaeologists, and they found art from Neanderthal, and they calculate that this art was over 1 million years old. So the whole notion that humanity only existed for 6,000 years or 7,000 years is being definitely proven to be false, even by science, archaeology, and such. Different ruins they have found. In North India, Pakistan area, they unearthed a whole very sophisticated civilization that is calculated to be hundreds of thousands of years old. So, this being the point, that the time frame that we're talking about in relationship to the understanding coming from the Gita is millions of years. So Satya Yuga, which has this environment of wisdom, what are some of the other characteristics? Wisdom, virtue, religiosity. That is 100% of the population have those characteristics. And it lasts 1,728,000 years. In the Treta Yuga, vice is introduced, and the Yuga lasts 1,296,000 years. So what this means is, in Satya Yuga, I've heard it described as 100% of the population possesses wisdom, virtue, and religiosity. As time wears on, time has a degenerative influence. So as time wears on, also consciousness, or the level of consciousness, is influenced. And herein, Prabhupada says, vice seeps into humanity, and then 75% of humanity has the noble characteristics of virtue, religiosity, and wisdom. And then there's 25% of the population that is conditioned otherwise. So this is Treta Yuga, and this is after the Satya Yuga, which lasts for 1,728,000. And Treta goes for 1,296,000. And then the third Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, is there's even a greater decline in virtue and religion and wisdom. Vice increasing, where 50% of the population is now influenced by these malevolent qualities. So you have 50% of the population still being predominantly influenced by sattva gun, or mode of goodness, which is characterized by virtue, wisdom, and religiosity. But 50% of the population is being influenced predominantly by passion, rajagun, and ignorance, tamagun. And therefore, the result of that influence is there is a particular affinity towards vice, activity, which is against the instructions of the Supreme. And then Treta Yuga lasts for 864,000 years. And finally, in Kali Yuga, which is the present day and age. And Kali Yuga lasts for 432,000 years. Now we are 5,000 years into Kali Yuga. So that's all called one cycle, just to put it into perspective. You do the math. 1,728,000 plus 1,296,000 plus 864,000 plus 432,000. If you do that math, that is the length, time length of a cycle. And so what is that? Keep that in mind, because now we're getting into vice in Kali Yuga increases, where at the end of Kali Yuga, almost no one possesses the characteristics of virtue, wisdom, and religiosity. And I think we're getting a good taste of that now. If you follow the news at all and see the state of the world as we know it today, we can see that we are progressing in that manner, that people are killing each other over land and protracted possession of that land, and or religion, or ideological differences, etc. And there's so much corruption in government. When you hear the description of what a government should be like, coming from the Bhagavad Gita and texts in the Srimad Bhagavatam, you see that the leader is called a Rajarshi. And a Rajarshi is the combination of two Sanskrit words, Raja meaning king, and Rishi meaning saintly personality. So the description of king or leadership, the quality, one of the main qualities is that the king or the leader has to be of a saintly nature. And we can witness in so many different governments, doesn't matter capitalist or communist or socialist, etc. We see that very simply the leadership does not possess those qualities, but rather leadership possesses qualities which are more self-centered on their own acquisition, gain, fame, and etc. So this is the manifest symptom of Kali Yuga. Leadership goes down. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita in a previous chapter, yat yat acharati shreshtas tat evetaro janaha sayat pramanam kurute lokastam. So whatever a great man does, common men will follow. Whatever the leader does, all the world pursues. So we're seeing that the role models, the current role models in the form of leadership, and it's not only in politics, it's also in religion. It's on so many different levels. The characteristics of leadership have been influenced by vice, by self-centeredness, desire for self-acclaim, and this is what puts the world in such a topsy-turvy condition. So I'm going to continue reading here because it gives us a very nice understanding of what this verse is talking about. So we talked about Kali Yuga. There's an abundance of strife, ignorance, irreligion, and vice. True virtue being practically non-existent. And this yuga lasts 432,000 years, and we're 5,000 years into it. In Kali Yuga, vice increases to such a point that at the termination of the yuga, the Supreme Lord himself appears as the Kalki avatar, vanquishes the demoniac, saves his devotees, and commences another Satya Yuga, or ends that one cycle and another cycle begins again. When Kali Yuga ends, then there is a rejuvenation and Satya Yuga again is born. The golden age comes back. So that's what's being spoken about here. These 4 yugas, rotating 1,000 times, comprise one day of Brahma, the creator God, and the same number comprise one night. Brahma lives 100 of such years and then dies. These 100 years, by Earth calculation, total to 311 trillion and 40 million Earth years. By these calculations, the life of Brahma seems fantastic and interminable. But from the viewpoint of eternity, it is as brief as a lightning flash. So again, as I say, Krishna is constantly giving us reminders that the nature of the material world is temporary. Even it may have the ability to perpetuate for as long as Brahma can live, 311 trillion, 40 million years, but still it dies. Brahma dies. And there is, again, a dissolution and then a manifestation of the universe as we know it. So this is Krishna saying that, to desire to cling to life, it's one of the kleshas that Patanjali talks about, which obstruct our desire for spirituality, is clinging to life. So this desire to cling to life with the hopes, if you accept the fact that there is reincarnation, and that you'll get a better life next time around. But being within the wheel of samsara, the wheel of birth and death, only means that you're acting under the laws of material nature, thus accruing karmic reaction. And as long as you have karmic reaction to experience, you have to take birth after birth after birth after birth. So the chances of accruing only good karma and thus having only good reactions in one's next life are very, very slim, because people are, prone to making mistakes. One of the definitions of sin that I really like, which is non-Judeo-Christian, is the making mistake, and a mistake of judgment, an error in judgment. It's one of the earliest definitions in Latin of what the word sin actually means. So what does that mean? It means in the course of our life, we kind of get our priorities wrong, place the blessing or the benediction of our human energy and our human intelligence to only try to make our life in the here and now pleasant. And, we go on and on trying to arrange things in such a way that we're always experiencing pleasure, even though we try as we may, we're always experiencing some kind of suffering along the way also. So Krishna is trying to have us understand this one single principle, that in contact with the material energy, there is subsequent suffering. The nature of the soul is to be free from suffering. So as long as the soul is connected with and interacting with the material energy, the soul is experiencing something that it's not. And that is what it's creating within us, a kind of a dissatisfaction or unfulfillment. We often ask ourselves, why am I not happy? I was reading Dr. Laurie Santos, who is a professor at Yale University and the creator of one of the most attended classes in university history. It's called The Science of Well-Being. One of the motivating forces, she's a PhD in psychology, and one of the motivating forces for her to create this class, The Science of Well-Being, which is actually a study of happiness, a kind of an attempt a scientific, objective study of what makes people happy. And one of the reasons, one of the motivating forces, is that she is a professor at Yale University, and we know the Ivy League schools like Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Duke, etc., are some of the most privileged young adults in our country and around the world attend that university. She, as a psychologist and a professor, one of her responsibilities was to counsel students. And she couldn't believe that students were there was so much suffering and misery and dissatisfaction amongst students who came from families that were A, well educated, B, had a lot of money, C, were well situated on the social order. And so these were privileged, very privileged young people, young men and women, but yet they were experiencing such a dissatisfaction with their life. And Dr. Santos was trying to understand, why is it that people who have so much to be thankful for are suffering so much? And that's what was the motivating force for getting that class together, which has gleaned a lot of interest from many different stratus of student. So that's our nature. Our nature is to experience happiness, pleasure. We are nature-seeking entities and nature-experiencing entities. That's our nature. Happiness-seeking entities, pleasure-seeking entities. So when, due to a certain mindset, we're experiencing displeasure with our situation, unhappiness, misery, suffering, then what does that cause? So from the perspective of Gita, the cause is we're just misidentifying with a situation, a set of circumstances, which is not really what we are and who we are. And that means we're not the body, we're the soul. And unless and until we begin to relate to ourselves as pure spiritual beings that have the intrinsic characteristics or qualities of eternity, knowledge, and bliss, then we can't find happiness or fulfillment or satisfaction, contentment, because we are operating in a temporary, ever-changing field of activities, and that never satiates our desire to experience pleasure. So that's what Krishna is saying here, and that's why Krishna is going through in this particular section of the Gita, giving us an understanding. It doesn't matter. All beings of this world, no matter how long or short they live, their life is temporary. So Brahma, who is the chief living being of all living beings, he, even after living 311 trillion, 40 million years, has to experience death. Now, of course, because Brahma is a very exalted being, when he dies, he achieves liberation. In fact, he has a planet within the material universe called Brahmaloka or Satyaloka. And many pious beings, religious-minded beings who don't achieve full God consciousness at the time of death can go to that planet. So at the time of dissolution, those beings, given the opportunity to continue with sadhana or continue with spiritual practice there, that at the time of dissolution of the universe, they are liberated. They are liberated and they go back to Godhead or back into the spiritual realm of existence. So let's finish this just to get a very comprehensive understanding of this verse. Okay, I read, by these calculations, the life of Brahma seems fantastical and interminable. I read that. In the causal ocean, there are innumerable Brahmas, rising and disappearing like bubbles in the Atlantic Ocean. Brahma and his creation are all part of the material universe, and therefore they are in constant flux. In the material universe, not even Brahma is free from the process of birth, old age, disease, and death. Brahma, however, is directly engaged in the service of the Supreme Lord in the management of this universe. Therefore, he at once attains liberation. Elevated sannyasis are promoted to Brahma's particular planet, Brahmaloka, which is the highest planet in the material universe, and which survives all the heavenly planets in the upper strata of the planetary system. But in due course, Brahma and all the inhabitants of Brahmaloka are subject to death according to the law of material nature. And that is one of the main points that Krishna is trying to get across. According to the law of material nature, there is at best a temporary existence. And even if you are in the higher strata of humanity, there are 8,400,000 species of life. And even you can read in some science journals, they also concur that there's over 8 million species of life. So of the 8,400,000 species, it is said in the Vedas that there are 400,000 species of human life. Now, what that actually means is it really relates not so much to human bodies, but human levels of consciousness. So from a very low level of consciousness to very exalted level of consciousness, like Brahma and the various demigods, this, no matter what situation you are in and how long the duration of time you are in that particular body, there ultimately is an end to it. So therefore it's considered temporary. Now, another interesting point to note is that time is perceived differently according to the species that the soul is in. So what does that mean? It means, like in the human form of life, the soul is situated in this human form of life, and its perception of the world around it in terms of time and time calculation is by 100 years. In other words, Prabhupada has pointed out that human life is at most 100 years. Now, and we experience it as we are experiencing it. Like I'm 73 years old, so I've experienced 73 years. And, it may, to my son who's 8 years old, it may seem like, wow, you're really old, Dad, a long time. But the reality is, we are perceiving it in such a way through our karma, how we are equipped karmically in a situation, and in this particular level of consciousness, this human form or human level of consciousness, we perceive everything, in terms of old age and all that, in terms of 100 years that we experience. But a fruit fly, which may only live according to our time calculation, maybe 48 hours or 72 hours, but from the perspective of the fruit fly, the soul that inhabits that particular form, they are also living 100 years or 72 years or 75 years. So I hope you're getting my point. My point is that if you're in a fruit fly body, you're not perceiving it as 48 hours like we are perceiving. You're perceiving it as a full lifespan. And all life form, no matter what is their average age, perceive it as a full lifespan. And that is the workings of the material nature on consciousness as it is projected outwards through a particular mind and set of senses, and body, meaning like the elephant, mind and senses and its projection outward, the fruit fly, mind and senses and projected outwards. They're all perceiving their reality in terms of a time factor which is relative to their form. I know that was a mouthful. I hope you got it. If not, don't hesitate to ask questions. But again, whether you understand it or not, the essential point to understand is that living in this material world is temporary. It is full of ignorance, and there's suffering and ultimately death. That is the main point. And the soul itself, in its constitutional nature of eternity, knowledge, and bliss, does not feel happy or content or fulfilled in that environment. So due to the influence of the modes, if that's what we are perceiving, only what we are getting through our senses, and there is no higher level of perception which is coming from pure consciousness, then that is the cause of suffering. And Krishna wants us to know, and is explaining it in so many different ways in the Gita so that we do get that. We do get that point. So let me see. Yeah, we finished that verse. So I'm going to take a moment. Does anyone have a question or a comment, observation that would be joyfully received now and in the form of questions or comments, etc.? Does anyone have anything they would like to say before we move on to the next verse? It was a lot, but I felt it necessary, to put these sets of verses that we're doing now into proper context. Anyone? Sid, are you okay? Yeah?
Yes, I am. I have no
Jane, are you
questions.
okay? Okay. All right, everyone seems to be fine. We will continue with text 18. And at the beginning of Brahma's day, all living entities become manifest from the unmanifest state. And thereafter, when the night falls, they are merged into the unmanifest again. So here, Krishna is talking about even the living entity is eternal as long as it's within contact of the material nature, the material elements. Then that connection to the material elements cause repeated birth and death and rebirth. And then Krishna is putting it into a time frame here. Okay? This is text 19. Again and again, when Brahma's day arrives, all living entities come into being. And with the arrival of Brahma's night, they are helplessly annihilated. A reiteration of that point of cycle. Yet there is another. What is this here? Stop, please. My alarm. Yet there is another unmanifest nature which is eternal and is transcendental to this manifested and unmanifested matter. So Krishna is very specifically saying here, I got it. Very specifically saying here, matter is manifest and unmanifested. So it goes through a period of becoming, and then being annihilated, and then again manifesting. Whereas now Krishna is saying there's another nature. Now this is very similar, if you remember, to chapter 7. And if I may, I'll go back to the beginning of chapter 7, because Krishna says it in a different way there, where he's making the same point. He says, no idea what's going on. Okay, that should take care of it. So let's get back to the point of chapter 7, where Krishna first describes Prakriti, the material energy. And then what does he say after he describes it? I already gave it to you, where he says earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego. Altogether, these 8 comprise my separated material energies. And what does he say in the next, in text 5 of chapter 7? Besides this inferior nature, that's how Krishna labels the material energy inferior, because it's not eternal. It manifests and unmanifests. And that's why he terms it as such. There is a superior energy of mind, which are all living entities who are struggling with material nature and are sustaining the universe. So again, I make my point that Krishna is giving us in various ways the understanding of matter is not life or full of life. Matter is infused with life by the presence of Purusha or spiritual energy, or in our individual cases, spiritual energy in the form of the jiva. The jiva, or the soul, is spiritual energy. And thus, when spiritual energy comes in contact with material energy, that's when there is manifestation there. That's when material energy begins to take form, take shape. So that's what Krishna is saying. Annihilation and then manifestation. Unmanifest, manifest. That is how this world, with the presence of the jiva, the soul, is operating. Now we're on verse 21. That which the Vedantists described as unmanifest and infallible, that which is known as the supreme destination, that place from which, having attained it, one never returns, that is my supreme abode. Okay, so Krishna is describing this world as temporary, full of ignorance, and full of suffering. That is the nature of the material world, and our involvement in it as souls that are in material bodies, souls that are in connection with that material energy, in the manner of having a body that is comprised of the 8 elements that Krishna is talking about. And those 8 elements being activated, motivated, because of the presence of the soul. And that happens at the time of conception. Within the sperm is the soul. Within the woman is a cluster of material elements in the form of the egg. And when the sperm enters into that egg, that's the soul coming in full contact with a material environment, and thus everything is activated. And the bubble, the ovum, takes shape and begins to form as an embryo. So Krishna is saying here, the Vedantists, those who are learned in the Vedas, describe as unmanifest and infallible. So the material nature is fallible. In other words, it breaks apart and it goes through a cycle of change. Now he's describing the spiritual realm. There is no change. It doesn't manifest and unmanifest at all. It is totally stable and unchanging, and therefore infallible. That which is known as the supreme destination, a place from which, having attained it, one never returns. That is my supreme abode, Krishna says. So Krishna is making the distinction between the world we're living in and the spiritual realm, which is Krishna's abode. Next verse, which is 22. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is greater than all, is attainable by unalloyed devotion. Although he is present in his abode, he is all-pervading, and everything is situated within him. Wonderful description of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bhagavan, and Bhagavan's abode, and the ultimate destination of the Bhakti Yogi. In particular, the Bhakti Yogi's destiny. When we talk about yoga and we talk about sadhana, there's a distinct purpose and goal in the execution of that yoga process and that yoga goal, that yoga practice. And for a Bhakti Yogi, everything that you see that is within the sadhana of a Bhakti Yogi is meant to connect consciousness to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Supreme Personality of Godhead's abode, the Supreme Personality of Godhead's entourage. All of these elements, all of these various aspects of the Supreme, whether it be the person or the abode or the those in relationship to the Supreme Personality, all of the actions and remembrances within the context of sadhana or the practice of the Bhakti Yogi is meant to connect us to that realm. In other words, we can be in this stage of our life. We can be fully God conscious. We can attain that level of God consciousness. And we have various examples throughout the history of Vaishnavism, throughout the history of Bhakti Yoga. Great personalities like Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, all the various saints and great personalities who came with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu over 500 years ago. You see that these are personalities who are in a liberated state of consciousness, which means they are not influenced or subject to the influence of the material laws of nature. They have transcended that and are living, even while embodied, in that state of consciousness. Okay. Let's go on to the next text, which is 23. O best of the Bharatas, I shall now explain to you the different times at which, passing away from this world, the yogi does or does not come back. So this is tied into when a yogi will depart from the body or an ordinary person will depart from the body, is usually indicative of where they're heading. Krishna says in the 24th verse of chapter 8, those who know the Supreme Brahman attain that Supreme by passing away from the world during the influence of the fiery God in the light at an auspicious moment of the day, during the fortnight of the waxing moon, or during the 6 months when the sun travels in the north. The mystic, this is 25, the mystic who passes away from this world during the smoke, the night, the fortnight of the waning moon, or the 6 months when the sun passes to the south, reaches the moon planet, but again comes back. According to Vedic opinion, there are 2 ways of passing from this world, one in light and one in darkness. When one passes in light, he does not come back. But when one passes in darkness, he returns. So even if one has lived a particularly auspicious life, if at the crucial juncture of the soul leaving the body, remembrance is not there, the connection is not there with the supreme nature, excuse me, the supreme personality of Godhead or his divine nature, then one can pass at a particular time, which is the time of darkness, and which is indicative, even if they're achieving or attaining heavenly planets, indicative of the fact that they are returning to the material world. And text 27, although the devotees know these 2 paths, O Arjuna, they are never bewildered. Therefore, be always fixed in devotion. And verse 28, a person who accepts the path of devotional service is not bereft of the results derived from studying the Vedas, performing austere sacrifices, giving charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, he attains all these, and at the end, he reaches the supreme eternal abode. So what is this verse talking about? First, one has to accept the path of devotional service. What does that mean? What is an indication of one accepting the path of devotional service? It means that one is seriously engaged in executing the various aspects of bhakti sadhana, chanting, swadhyaya. Rupa Goswami says there's 5 rather, very powerful limbs of bhakti: chanting, kirtan and japa, sadhu sangha, association with great saintly personalities, tirtha, actually going to holy places, traveling to holy places to rejuvenate one's remembrance of the Supreme. And then there is Swadhyaya, or the study of sacred texts like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. And then finally, there is ritual, or in the case of bhakti, it means like deity worship in that regard. Okay, so a person who accepts the path of devotional service, that is what is meant by them accepting. The results derived from studying Vedas, performing austere sacrifices, giving in charity, or pursuing philosophical and fruitive activities. Simply by performing devotional service, he attains all these, and at the end, he reaches the supreme eternal abode. And that is the conclusion of chapter 8. So I will, we have a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any question, comment, observation, like to share anything with myself or others that are listening in? Be happy to address that. If not, I'll end here. I want to thank you very much Triana, I want to tell you we're heading to Puerto Rico tomorrow. So we hope to see you.
Most
And-
definitely. That's so exciting, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. We hope to see you and your beautiful baby while we're there. We're going to be there for about 8 days.
Most definitely.
So we'll keep in touch, okay? All right. So everyone have a great evening. Have a great week. Make sure your week is healthy, happy, and holy. Until we see each other again next week, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna,
Krishna.
Prabhu. See you soon.
Okay.
Hare Krishna.